how much is it choosing your own reality, and how much is it just accepting the reality that's been handed to you by your demagogue?
Today is Saturday, September 11th. The year is 2021. This is No Easy Answers, and I'm your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. Well, thank you for tuning in from wherever you happen to be listening. My name is Jules Taylor, this is No Easy Answers, and I am delighted to have you with us for today's episode. No Easy Answers is a podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition, and today I have a very timely conversation for you. Joining me on the show today are two esteemed colleagues of the podcasting world. We have Professor David Parsons, historian of the Vietnam War and host of the long-running podcast called Nostalgia Trap. And we have Maximillian Alvarez, who is editor-in-chief at the Real News Network and host of the Working People podcast. Honestly, I feel really fortunate to be in dialogue with these comrades, and I'm just going to attempt to keep my gushing to a minimum here in the intro, because the three of us had, at the start of this conversation, a lot of kind and complimentary words to say about the work we do on Working People, on Nostalgia Trap, and No Easy Answers. But all of that is said within the larger context of examining the role of independent media, and as you'll hear, this is a rather long and rich conversation. David, Max, and I thought it was important that we reflect on the historical moment we just lived through as we approach the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and this episode will be published on the afternoon of September 11th. So, there's also this question that I've been stewing on in my mind over the last few weeks, and that question is how we characterize the historical memory. I think we have a way of looking to the past with a bit of rose-colored glasses. The way we associate the Woodstock 69 concert and Jimi Hendrix playing the national anthem with that era, that aspect does a lot of work in separating the historical memory from the realities of war. And it really got me thinking about how we are going to characterize these contemporary moments, and so I could not think of a better guest to bring some of these concerns to. David's podcast is called Nostalgia Trap, and that title represents a larger concept that has to do with how we tell history. And Max, well, if you listen to the Working People podcast, then you know about the brilliance of Max's work already. You might already be familiar with his current work through the Real News Network, or any of his past work with like Dissent magazine, or The Baffler, or the Chronicle of Higher Education, and others. But what never ceases to amaze me about Max? Max is a guy who loves Russian literature, and I bring that up to say that much in the same way that authors like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy can masterfully detail the duality of both suffering and beauty within the human condition, when Max turns on his interpretational lens, he can draw poetry out of tragedy in remarkable ways. There's a point towards the start of this conversation where Max is speaking about some of the scenes we witnessed of cargo planes leaving the airport in Kabul that, honestly, it just kind of took the wind out of me. So I'm very excited to bring you this conversation between myself, Max Alvarez, and David Parsons. Links to their podcasts and other works are in the show notes. I just want to give both of these guys a huge thank you for having this conversation with me. Go follow these guys on Twitter, go subscribe to their Patreon, support the work that they do because their work is so deserving of wider recognition. I not only think that listeners of this show will enjoy their content, but I also think listeners of this show would be enriched by the content that David and Max create. So here's my conversation with David Parsons and Maximillian Alvarez. So I just want to say, first of all, David, I came into encounter with your work through some of the first podcasts I listened to, and you did this amazing episode on Rev Left with Brett about the Vietnam War and a lot of The documentary of like Hearts and Minds was thrown in there, and I think and I've gone back and listened to that episode a couple different times, but it was such a profound episode that really reinvigorated my interest in that historical era. And so,
well, thanks for saying that. I appreciate that. That was like I remember talking with him over the course of like a couple hours, and what they did with that conversation was kind of amazing. I'm glad they cut out all the stupid shit I said and put the good stuff in, because that was a really fun conversation. And yeah, I got a lot of people responded to that. I think the stuff that they mixed in with Hearts and Minds just made it all super brutal. And that's a vision of the Vietnam War that people, I guess, are longing for, something a little bit different.
Yeah, and Max, obviously you and I are comrades, and we're kind of podcast husbands in a way. Yeah, I just hit record here, and I just wanted to take a moment, get all of the gushing that we have, mutual gushing for each other, out of the way before we proceed to, and we can cut some of that out or what have you, so.
I mean, it's actually a practice that I would highly encourage more folks in this media space to kind of engage in, right? Because there's really no sense in pretending that any of us kind of crawled out of the proverbial womb fully formed, knowing everything that we know now, right? I mean, Jules, as you yourself know, you came on to Working People at the beginning of the 4th season, and we've, I think, done, a lot of great things this season that I'm really proud of. But I mean, even just thinking about the way that the show has grown in this past year is kind of mind-boggling. And it's even more mind-boggling to put myself back into the time space when I was just thinking about starting a podcast. I didn't know where to start. I didn't know what I wanted it to be. I didn't know if I'd be any good at it. And the first person that I called was David. So Nostalgia Trap was the first podcast I ever got really into. That was. I mean, I think David and their show has grown in kind of amazing ways, and it's really just a kind of incredible kind of I guess oral history, to use the annoying term, oral history, right, of this past better half of a decade, about left thought, about history and historiography. And that was just like catnip for me. And there was just something about David's conversational style, the kinds of questions that he would ask, the kind of perpetual curiosity that always, it was a down-to-earth curiosity that I found very endearing and made me always think that David's students must be very lucky to have him as a teacher. And, I reached out to him. He didn't know me from Adam. And, I was just like, hey, man, I really love your show. I'd love to talk sometime. And, to David's credit, not to make him blush, I mean, he said, sure, let's hop on the phone. He talked me through the history of the Nostalgia Trap. He talked me through basic stuff like what programs he used. When I was trying to record that very first episode with my dad, I was frantically texting David, being like, "What fucking setting do I put this recorder on?" and he walked me through it. So in many ways, Working People would not exist without David.
Well, that does make me feel very uncomfortable to hear all that, in part because podcasting is. And thank you, Max. I mean, I remember those conversations, and to me, the fact that someone else was listening and it inspired someone else to like start their own podcast was just the most incredible thing. But also all of this has been a learning process. I mean, we're all doing, I didn't anticipate that I would be doing independent media, or that would be my sort of role in public life. I mean, I sort of went to graduate school thinking this would be a place to escape for a little while from a post 9/11 hellscape, and ended up, doing a podcast because it just felt like natural as an extension of graduate school to talk to professors and graduate students, and it turned out to be something larger than that. But I'm so happy that when I remember, Max, when you first proposed the idea of Working People to me, I thought, God, I wish I'd thought of that. That's such a great idea, and one that has just infinite possibilities because it's such a vast, it's such a vast hole, such a vast gap in our everyday conversations, and yet it's it's like the living experience of most people is sort of like what working life is like and what that might mean and how it might intersect with politics and history and the moment we're in. All of that to me is just an incredible gift, and I'll stop gushing at you too, Max. But I think that what you've done with working people is really impressive from just a media standpoint, but it's also, I wouldn't want to lose track of what makes it really important, which is that it's about people and about giving voice to people that don't often get a voice. And that part of it is something that's the most vital part of it, apart from all of us doing our podcasts in all our different ways.
Thanks, brother. I appreciate that.
For sure.
Yeah, man. One more thing I want to say about all of this is that, when I first started, my podcast, I had these moments where I was like, am I really going to tap this person on the shoulder and ask to speak to them? Like, am I? And it seems like such a, like I've said before, that it seems like kind of a weirdly narcissistic thing to do, to be a guy who reads a book and then like says, hey, what's up, author of this book? Come talk to me on this podcast. And it's like very, anyway, it takes a certain amount of confidence in order to actually do that thing. And so early on in that process, I asked Max, I was like, man, I want to reach out to this person, and I'm kind of, maybe I'm a little more afraid of like, what if he says yes? And Max, very sort of like, in a way that like taught me something in that moment, was like, look, man, if you're thinking deeply on a topic, and if you are really wrestling with questions that someone has dedicated their life to studying, they probably do want to speak to you. And they would probably delight them, and it would probably be something they would be open to, and so it's amazing to hear you and Max speak about the way working people started. In that's basically what Max did, was reached out to someone and tapped them on the shoulder. So all this coming full circle, and having you on the show finally, David, and finally kind of having Max on as a guest is something that is it's really like it makes my heart swell. I'm really happy to be doing this.
Well, you're doing really great work, man. I mean, if we're talking here about how shows have grown, you and I have talked about this throughout the pandemic. Like, No Easy Answers really grew out of the pandemic when you couldn't do as much musical work. And I think that, you've turned it from kind of, this outlet for that served a deep intellectual need for you, something that seemed without which you might actually start like eating yourself internally. Sure. But you've, I think in a really impressive way, you've been able to open that up and invite other people into it in a way that is still really engaging. It's challenging, but not, esoteric. And that's, that's a really powerful thing. Again, something that I think we observe and learn from people who do it well. And I just wanted to kind of bring it all back full circle, because I remember that conversation that you and I had about that. And in fact, that is another thing that David helped me realize, right? Because we were talking about this in the context of academia, but I was like, man, how do you know all these people? How do you get all these people on your show, right? And he told me, he's like, well, some of them I know, others I just kind of reach out to, but in a lot of ways, it feels very good and gratifying, and like we are collectively doing what we can to put forth work that actually makes some semblance of a difference, or that we believe, like has value and merit. It's I think a real testament to the collaborative effort there, that this sort of knowledge and these tricks of the trade are handed down by people who want to see others succeed. And it was David who said to me, maybe not exactly in these terms, but he was like, yeah, like if you spend your entire life, researching like this one topic and writing books on this one topic, and some eager student, who's read your stuff, who really wants to talk about it, who's really clearly thinking a lot about it, reaches out to you and asks if you'll talk about it. Again, like we're so afraid that they're going to think that we're assholes, but it's just like, why wouldn't they want to talk about that? And what David added to that was like, if after all that they don't want to talk to you, then you don't fucking want them on your show. Like, why would you want to talk to an asshole who who wants to spend their entire life researching this stuff, but not talk to people who are interested in it?
And that's changed a lot just since I started in 2014. I mean, when I would write to people and say, hey, do you want to record this podcast? I had to explain what a podcast was. I had to be like, this is a, kind of a independent recording that I'll put online. And it was a lot of skepticism from people. But now, it's amazing how quickly things have changed and people are ready to go on podcasts. People know what they are, and they're even ready to talk to people. I mean, it's almost seen as a part of the publicity circuit now. I mean, one thing that's changed dramatically in just the years I've been doing the podcast is I get emails from like publicists who are like, would you interview our author? And like, sometimes it's a book that has nothing to do with anything I would ever talk about on Nostalgia Trap, but they feel like, something told them that that a podcast is where they need to be. So that's been a really weird thing to be a part of, to see that like, it became normal to sort of have big guests on shows with quote unquote ordinary people. And that's actually been really fun. That was my dream always, was just to like get bigger and bigger people. I thought, why not try for this person? You can find them online. You can find their email address. And Max, you're right. If you just, it's not about, if you just like let them know that you're interested in their work, not just like, oh, come on my podcast, I heard you have a book, but say something, substantive to them about what you liked about their book and what you found engaging about it, what you'd like to talk with them about. Yeah, who wouldn't want to get that email? I mean, that's like it's exactly what you want to do, is get your work out there. So I don't know. It's been really exhilarating. And now the thing that's changed is just how many podcasts there are. How like when a person is on the podcast circuit, I all of a sudden see this author on like 8 different podcasts at once. So it was a Wild West market before and is now. And I think that, it'll continue evolving. Podcasts are a huge business now. And I think that's the big change that's happened. I don't have to explain what podcasts are to anybody anymore.
All right. So now that we got all the gushing out of the way, maybe we should, we can start with, I planned this whole, speaking of podcasts and shit like that, the format and stuff, I was planning on trying to, cold open this with a very dramatic, today is Thursday, September 9th. The year is 2021. This is No Easy Answers, and I'm your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. Maybe I wasn't drawn from there, but to start this out and kind of situate things, and to use Max's language, how to set the table, we'll say the war in Afghanistan is over, and on August 30th, military transport planes flew the last remaining soldiers out of Hamid Karzai International Airport, and this marked the end of the longest war in United States history, coming to a close near the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And as news began to circulate about the final troops being flown out of Afghanistan, we saw footage of the tarmac of planes accelerating to take off, and we saw hundreds of Afghan civilians running alongside the aircraft, desperately seeking to leave the country by any means possible. And so as I sat and watched some of these horrific videos on my Twitter timeline, I was kind of struck by a certain parallel. And maybe this is just I don't know, my inner something about me. I noticed this thing where I was like, I couldn't help but relate, poor, desperate Afghan souls clinging to the sides of aircrafts who would ultimately fall, those related to me as the way this whole thing began on September 11th, watching people actually jump from the World Trade Center. It got me thinking that there was a whole lot of historical parallels to notice within all of this. And I think, some of those were more obvious and kind of noticed right away. We saw images of the U.S. Embassy being evacuated by helicopters, and folks were quick to point out how this resembled the images we have from the last days of the Vietnam War, when the embassy in Saigon was evacuated by helicopter. Today, I'm very happy to have with me 2 people we've already gushed about, Mr. David Parsons, Mr. Maximillian Alvarez, and we're going to talk about a few of these things. I don't know, does that sound good, guys?
Sounds good.
Okay.
I mean, it doesn't sound good because none of anything you described is good.
It's an awful conversation we're fixing to have,
Well,
but
yeah.
it can be pretty too at times, I guess. But.
It's obviously, I'm glad you mentioned that word obvious, because it was just like those images of people falling out of the sky brought up 9/11, the images of the embassy and desperate people trying to evacuate brought up the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War. It was literally impossible not to make those sort of historical connections, because it's so in your face. If you know anything about American history, these are icons of the last 50 years of American foreign policy, and they don't represent particularly great things. So, in terms of the Vietnam stuff, I mean, I would say that it's a number of different feelings and ideas at the end of the war in Afghanistan that are complicated. And I know that's like a very historian academic way of putting it, but I think that there is like the mainstream media, whatever we call that, wants to create a narrative one way or the other. Like, was this good? Was this bad? And a lot gets lost in that. To me, like the parallels of the United States, basically attempting this nation building exercise in the midst of an imperial war of domination and violence, and seeing that the U.S. just pull out of that at the end of the war is one that is a really difficult thing to unpack if you're a thoughtful person. I don't think it falls into a left or right perspective necessarily. I have difficulty. I don't know about you guys, but I don't have easy. I mean, you talk about the name of this podcast, No Easy Answers. I don't have an easy answer for what's right here, because on the one hand, the United States leaving Afghanistan is absolutely a desirable outcome. We've spent 20 years there, decimating the people and not achieving any of the goals that we set out to achieve. At the same time, the way that the United States pulls out, it just highlights all of that. It just highlights how shitty the occupation was and how little the people at the bottom of the ladders in Afghanistan mattered to us at all. The images are wrenching, and they make us think of other things like 9/11 in Vietnam, in part because to me it's like we're watching big states and imperial states make their moves, and those bodies that fall from the sky, those are the victims of that. That's the end point of that. And like that part, I think is very hard to reconcile in the United States for Americans that have very specific visions of what we are, what the country's mission is in the world, what our troops do, etc. You see, like the politics are weird, and I think that that's something we can maybe get into. But the politics are not the same politics as the Vietnam War, right? Like things have changed. I don't think they've necessarily gotten better or worse. I don't know if we put them that way, but they're different. And the response to this is going to be different. I mean, those are my opening ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I imagine everyone listening have been reflecting on quite a bit of late, both with the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, like you said, Jules, thus ending the longest U.S. war, and also, we're recording this just a couple days before the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. And so I've been, really trying to, without falling into the nostalgia trap, as it were, really trying to remember what it was like then, like what I was like, what the world itself was like, both before and after, right? Because when you had mentioned to us that you wanted to kind of talk about this sort of horrifying visual parallel, I remember just that one picture. I think it's called the Falling Man, right? That was plastered on newspapers around the country, and this was for any Zoomers we have out there listening, because David, you'll know this, teaching people, it's weird that you have to kind of like teach people this stuff because, I mean, they might not have been born at the time, or they may have just been babies at the time.
They don't get my Billy Joel references either. You're right, though, dude. It's weird that, I mean, students in college, you're teaching college, they were born after 9/11 now. It's not that they don't remember it. They weren't even alive yet. And that's a totally different way of thinking about history when you're communicating to young people. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty bonkers to think about, right? And to think about, you know, what it means to, you know, have lived pretty much your entire life, you know, like with the U.S. embroiled in this kind of regime of endless war, that is just such a taken for granted fact, you know, of American life, that it practically means nothing for the vast majority of people, right? It really is just, you know, wallpaper. It's just kind of, you know, the stuff that colors our surroundings, but, you know, doesn't really impact our lives in ways that we think about, or sense or know, you know, critically. I think again, it's just kind of something that's taken for granted. But, you know, I remember just, you know, how visually powerful that image of the falling man was, you know, what it meant for so many people, right? There was this kind of, I don't know, quietude, resignation. Like it was almost terrifying because he wasn't flailing, because you couldn't hear a scream. It just looked like a silent drop from, you know, unimaginable heights, to a quick death, right? And I don't know. It's like, There was something there when I was watching the kind of horrifying videos of the planes leaving the airport in Kabul, right? And, you know, terrified, panicked Afghans, you know, clinging to these planes and ultimately falling off of them to their deaths. You know, I don't think that I was reading as much into it, right? Because the falling man picture was a very kind of zoomed in picture, which I think kind of accentuated, right, that sort of eeriness that people were reading into it. Whereas what I was seeing, you know, in those videos from Kabul were just these little black specks of human beings, that I could barely even kind of make out the shape of, right? And I guess that's, you know, kind of where my initial, you know, sort of impressions to share like would go, right? Is like there's almost from Falling Man to Kabul, right? There's almost this kind of shifting out of focus.
Yeah.
You know,
Wow.
Yeah, it's so disturbing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's true. I mean, when it's something that the young people might not know about and remember about 9/11 is that, like, in that you guys remember, is that in the immediate, I mean, that's when the scroll started on the bottom of the screen of like 24-hour cable news. The idea that breaking news was happening all the time. There was almost this, like, I feel like there was an invitation into this world, like into the news and into like paying attention to what the president is doing. It's like we all have a responsibility to care. I remember my roommates and I, who were all just a bunch of stoners in a house in the valley, we felt a responsibility to turn on the State of the Union address and listen to George W. Bush lay out the plan of what we were going to do. All of a sudden, like, I mean, I never thought of myself as a really like patriotic dude that was going to be drafted in any national cause. And yet all of a sudden I'm sitting here listening to this, and that went away. That idea, like, it's funny because it was a nostalgia trap. It was like a brief, oh, is there going to be a moment of duty here? Am I going to have a responsibility in the same way that like my forefathers in World War II had a responsibility and answered the call? I thought that for a moment, but, you know, there wasn't a draft. There was Afghanistan and Iraq ended up playing out in really long, slow motion, gruesome ways as sort of backgrounds to our lives. And God, I can't think of a more poetic way of putting it than the way you put it just now, Max, which is that idea of the falling man being blurry and like more in the background and more. I mean, it's kind of it is a really great metaphor for how these wars became background. I wonder how operative they are in American politics. That's why when you hear like people in the New York Times, the Washington Post, wringing their hands saying, "What's this going to mean for Joe Biden?" I'm like, I really don't know. It seems like things have switched around in really, really weird ways. I associated when my politics were, when I came to political awareness after 9/11, I was thinking of the Republican Party and George W. Bush as this very specific thing. And I don't think of it quite the same way as I did then. And there's a lot to that. But the world has changed a lot, in part because 9/11 created these rifts and shifts.
Yeah, and I also think, David, you brought this sort of phrase to the front of my mind, and I've kind of stewed on it ever since. And I think it was just how we characterize a historical memory. Like you had talked recently about for listeners that aren't familiar with your stuff, you have NAM TV, this series that you started on your Patreon, and the first episode you started with playing the CCR music, and you were like, "Hello, everyone. Welcome to the documentary about America's war and how it's up." And you just were like, you can't even keep a straight face while saying it. And it got me really thinking about how, this another thing that you covered recently, which I had just watched this when you had brought it up on your show, but the new documentary about Woodstock 99 and all the terrible things that happened with that, right? But during the course of that documentary, they also went back and were like, hey, if Woodstock 99 was really bad, what makes you think Woodstock 69 was like was better than any of that? But there's, I live in Woodstock, New York, so there is this sort of like, I know the guy whose family got the rights from Michael Lang to popularize like the sort of Woodstock bird and the guitar logo stuff, like all that shit happened right here close to me. But I also thought, wow, it's gotten me very concerned around this concept of how we characterize the historical memory. And so I wanted to ask you, David, in a roundabout way, man, I guess, if you notice any more parallels with the Afghanistan and Vietnam thing, because to me there was like at one point I think I had a list of them going in my head, like one of them being like kind of the Gulf and Tonkin versus the weapons of mass destruction sort of thing, But I also wanted to ask you, because your show is called The Nostalgia Trap, and because I think I'm like intellectually stewing on things that came from you in this sense of like how we characterize historical memory. Those parallels is one question, but another question is, how do you see us characterizing this historical moment when we look at the ways we've characterized those couple I've just mentioned?
It's hard to say. I mean, I think that the thing that brings me that I think about a lot is sort of like when people think about the 60s, and you mentioned Woodstock, they have a certain sort of like, greatest hits in their head. And that's part of what I was getting at with the Creedence Clearwater Revival. And it's sort of like, there's a sense that like there's a couple key memories that everybody remembers, and that's that. And I wonder what those would be from the war in Afghanistan. Like, what are, in the 20 years since 9/11, what are the developments in American life, culture, and politics that connect to the war and that we would say are outgrowths of the war? Because so much of what we talk about when we talk about the 60s is how the Vietnam War served as a sort of centrifuge for a lot of the other conflicts that were happening. So when you talk about Vietnam, you can talk about gender, you can talk about race, you can talk about class, you can talk about all the different elements of American society and counterculture. Speaking of Creedence Clearwater Revival. So there's this sense that there was this whole set of historical phenomena that were connected to the war. And when I think about the war in Afghanistan, I mean, and the wars in Iraq, I mean, the kind of what are the things that people will look back and write the book of how did these things transform American society? It's a pretty bleak book. It doesn't have a sort of Woodstock moment where Jimi Hendrix plays the national anthem and we all understand something. Instead, like when I think about the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq and the years since 9/11, I think about surveillance. I think about terror. I think about the loss of civil liberties. I think about mass shootings, honestly, and the violence of the war touching and connecting into American society. I think about the civilian populations of these countries the United States is attacking who are invisible to us in both cases, except as props. I mean, to see people cynically talking about women's rights in Afghanistan and how that is automatically something that the United States military should be responding to, I find that all that stuff to be really confusing and cynical in the same way that the Vietnam War was. So I mean, in terms of parallels, it's more about sort of understanding that these are two different moments in the history of an empire, and that the imperial citizens, the people that are citizens of that empire, have experienced these wars in really very different ways because of our connections to them. I guess we said it would be dark, but yeah, the last 20 years have not been great when I think about these wars and what they've done to. I mean, it sounds even perverse to say what these wars have done to America. I mean, that's part of why I resent so much of the Vietnam War history, because all of it is like, look at what the Vietnam War did to America, and it's like, yeah, but we have to understand the like larger context of this war and the people that were most impacted by it. But that's just. To see that not really change, that's pretty disappointing. Because if there's one continuum in all of this, it's that the people that are the subjects of our violence are invisible, whether it be 2021 or 1969. And that's something that's immensely disturbing, but again, probably the expected byproduct of an imperial culture.
Well, like, I think there's, there was something there in how David framed that really got me thinking, and then I guess I just wanted to underline in red pen for folks listening, because it is the linchpin for the question that you asked, Jules, right? Like, how are we going to tell this history? Is obviously a question that, I imagine the three of us, think about a lot in many different contexts. But, one of the important ways to think about that question, right, is that, how we tell history, as David said, always depends on kind of where we're standing in it, right? And what the telling of that history means for the project of American empire, right? And so when we're talking about the history that American empire tells about itself, and the subjects of American empire tell about their history, there is something there that, the kind of Vietnam comparison, and even, the 20th century comparison, I think can be pretty revealing, right? One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, and I promise this detour has a point, right? But we started this conversation talking about independent media, what our role is, like how independent media or media in general in the past shapes the terms that people use to understand the reality that they're living in, let alone to have the capacity to imagine a different reality that they should be fighting for, right? Media does and needs to play a role in that. I'm not saying we all, that's the only thing that we do or that we're the only ones doing it, but, if I bring that up to say that, I think that there are a lot of there's a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? There are a lot of ways that we collectively, I think, need to look at kind of the terms of the discourse that we're participating in, the arguments that we're making, the terminology that we recycle, and we need to ask, like, do we need to revamp this? How do we kind of like update this? Like, have a lot of the things that we say about politics lost their meaning because, that meaning has become so super saturated over the years. And one of the, things that I've been thinking about, right, is how we define kind of the sides of the political arena, right? I think that we have this kind of left, right, conservative, liberal, socialist, that whole arrangement, right, was something that, was spatialized in our imagination after the French Revolution, right? And, it's kind of stuck as a nice moniker for us to be able to kind of understand what the terrain is. But I actually think it's about time that we start kind of thinking about these political positions in terms of each side's respective philosophy of history, how each side understands, its role in shaping history, right? Conservatives are very open, right, about having a historical vision that, is backward looking, that reverts back to some sort of paradise lost, right? Or that sees the solution to our present woes, not in some sort of like, future deus ex machina that's going to deliver an answer, but is we need to go back and revive answers that have already been presented in the course of human history and that have been lost under the kind of swell of quote unquote progress, right? This is how I used to think as a conservative. But you saw it obviously in Trump, make America great again, right? There's so much kind of backward looking nostalgia that still does assert itself as a coherent historical vision of what the right is fighting for politically. The left, I believe, is fighting for, a future that has not yet been attained, but, that will, it's a future worth fighting for because it's a future that will allow us to kind of overcome, the historical obstacles that have impeded our path to living in a more just, equitable, less planet destroying world, right? I mean, so there is, a very forward looking kind of future orientation for the left. What we have smack dab in the kind of monstrous center is, I think, a historical politics that since, the end of the Cold War, right, has been defined by sitting its fat ass on the clock of history and stopping that time, right? And kind of really approaching politics as, a form of world building that has more or less reached its completion in the imperial core. Now the main project is to kind of adjust the knobs, create enough equilibrium so that system, is maintained for time, until the end of time, and to spread, its tendrils out to other parts of the world to bring them into this kind of perpetual historical stasis, whether we call that, American hegemony, whether we call that capitalist imperialism, so on and so forth. I'll wrap this up in a second, right? So the reason I give all of that, I lay all that out, right, is that to understand what wars meant in the 20th century, right? I mean, I think that it's easier to kind of think about that question when you think that every war, even Vietnam, right, had its sort of chapter in an American story that had not yet reached its conclusion in the popular mind, right? America still felt it like it was moving towards a future and inheriting kind of its dominance, its deserved dominance in a future that was still ahead of it, right? And so how we performed in this or that war, what the casualties were, what it did to America, like David said, that was still kind of understood through that prism of the ever unfolding American project. Afghanistan is entirely different, right? I mean, what future have we been moving towards with this war, right? The very notion of an endless war carries with it a sort of end of history sort of conceit that it's almost like endless in the sense of space, not in time, right? That it's just something that is always there, right? But even going back 20 years ago, the very foundations of that war, right? The very culture of fear and jingoism that emerged out of 9/11 was very much in that vein. It was very protective. They want to take away our freedoms, the things that we already have. Here is this outside influence that is trying to encroach upon a historical stasis that needs to be maintained at all costs, right? And that is going to kind of be the perpetual justification of this war. Or if we take the liberal humanitarian version of it, we are going to export what we have historically attained to other parts of the world so that they can join us at the pinnacle of modernity. Does that make sense, or is the edible just kicking in?
No, all of that makes sense. And it also doesn't ring true at all to my experience at all in the sense of okay, I remember when Bush used the word crusade. I remember when George W. Bush invoked, the idea of civilizational war, etc. I mean, maybe because I was already kind of a left liberal kind of thinking person at the time. I just hated George W. Bush, and I thought he was racist against Muslim people. And even though when you look back, what Bush was saying was we can't, he made a couple speeches where he said we shouldn't be racist against Muslim people. So it's kind of extraordinary when you think of Trump compared to Bush. But either way, I didn't feel, again, drafted into any civilizational war at all here. I didn't feel like this was Starship Troopers and I was buying everything. In fact, among my friends said, and maybe this was a class thing. Maybe this speaks to the fact that I went to college and I talked with people that were in college. But the idea of like going to war and like fighting this war at all was just completely alien to us. And that's something that I brought up a lot because as a college teacher, I ask my students a lot, and it depends on what school you're at. If you're at community colleges, you are going to meet a lot of people who are in the military, veterans, etc. But as you move up the ladder of American higher education, the students are further and further detached from any possibility that they would be dragged into this war or that they would be serving in the war at all. I mean, when I was at NYU, I asked those kids, hey, how many of you considered military service? 0. It was 0. They were like, are you kidding me? And I asked them why. And it was because my parents would not allow me to do that. Like my parents wanted me to go to college and go get a great job where I make lots of money, etc. It was just not part of their landscape. And like the way that the war and the service in the war became segregated into the working class in a much more profound way than even the Vietnam War, because the Vietnam War did have a draft that, middle class and lower middle class people found themselves into the military. But in the years after, it became a working class job. And they this is a lot of what I talk about in the book, but like they extracted the draft, and in extracting the draft, they extracted any responsibility of citizenship connected to military service. And in doing that, they severed like whatever was any last link. And the rest has been a lot of nostalgia trap stuff. I mean, that's why I say the Republican Party, you could depend on them being the like support our troops, conservative, red-blooded, patriotic people. But it seems like that even that has changed. It seems like that, like the cynicism of that is really on the surface. The way that Trump invokes the troops in really ugly ways seems like it gives away a little bit of what their thing is. I don't know. Maybe that's my edible.
No, right. I mean, like, and even the things that people were shocked and horrified by in how Trump talked about it. Yeah. I mean, it's just like
Abu Ghraib. I mean, you remember how big Abu Ghraib scandal was? Mm-hmm. Do you remember? I mean, those images of prisoners being tortured. I mean, those images were everywhere, and they like seared into my imagination, and it felt like, wow. I mean, there were people talking on TV that were saying this is like a very, very serious moment in American history. It feels like we've gone so far down the ladder of like degradation and like the things that have become normal that like, yeah, those images aren't shocking anymore. I feel like if you went to an 18-year-old and said, hey, did you know that the American military tortures people in prisons in Iraq and Afghanistan, it'd be like, no shit, of course they do. There's like that to me, there's something disturbing about that. On the one hand, I don't want people to be like shocked in the sense that, oh my God, I believe that America was just, this kind of untouchable, graceful leader around the world, and now I'm shocked by that to discover that violence. It's something darker to me. It's something that's like a cynicism that's like, yeah, well, of course that exists. And that's something that, as an anti-war person in the 60s, a lot of those anti-war people were drawn into it from like a place of like, you call it corny, but they were drawn into it from a place of morality and humanity. It wasn't just strategic. It wasn't just like, oh, we're in Vietnam and we shouldn't because we're wasting our money. I mean, honestly, do you know how many people said, lefties, I heard so many left people say, well, it's good that we're drawing down the war in Afghanistan because now we can spend all that money on like canceling student loans and shit. And I'm like, it's such a weird way of thinking about what our place is in the world, and how we spend our money, and how nationalistic this would all be. Like the end of the war is good because now we can just retreat to our section of the world and spend it all on ourselves. There's like, that's the left position, really? Like that to me is an indication of how cynical and dark we've all come to a place. I mean, even just in our lifetime, you're right, Max. We were shocked by the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I don't know if people have the capacity for that shock anymore.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a
bleak. Sorry.
No. This is going to be. I knew this was going to be a bleak conversation. I think I'm grateful to have this platform to have these bleak conversations. Otherwise, people just look at me in casual conversation and be like, "Dude, you're a downer." But yeah, so I think there's kind of a space for this question within this, and I want to ask you, Max, about the role of media within this, because David, you wrote a book called Dark Grounds about like
dangerous grounds.
I'm so sorry, dangerous grounds.
No worries. Dark grounds sounds so lame.
Yeah, and dangerous grounds. Like I am an absolute sucker for a good pun. So I love the title of David's book.
Right.
Yeah, the book is about coffee houses, so that's why the grounds is there. Yeah.
Right. About coffee houses that sprung up in military towns that were trying to spread sort of anti-war, sort of build the movement of the anti-war movement, if I understand that correctly. And there was a quote that you quoted a historian in your book that said something that I'm trying to find it here in my notes. That access to complete or thoughtful criticism of the war and alternative political and cultural perspectives were a central factor in determining a young man's attitude towards military service. And this got me thinking, not in terms of like, I think there's obviously like within the last 20 years, there's been like a ubiquity of access, if you will. Like there's, these coffee houses now that need to spread. They live in your pocket. People are inundated with this information. And so it adds to the cynicism, as we were just talking about. But I'm concerned about the role of media within this, because I think that media is a central factor in determining our national attitudes. And by national attitudes, I mean, that could be a number of different things. It could be like a consensus on the historical narrative, which you've seen that kind of broken apart through various forms of media. Yep. And so Max, it's kind of a very intentionally vague question to have you, to turn you loose about media and what the role of media is concerning our. Has the media really been a central part of like why we are all disillusioned by this war? And what is the role of media concerning our national attitudes towards these imperialist agendas? I suppose.
Great question.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I apologize up front because I'm going to take the former academic Max's position on this, but I promise I'll try to make it palatable.
Here comes the postmodernism.
So I almost jumped in talking about postmodernism about 10 minutes ago. So it's going to come up, but we'll get there in due time. So, and you know what, again, this is just a one final gush, but I mean, David, as he's talked about on the show, right? For as much service as David has done, and the folks who have worked on his show have done to kind of bring these conversations to people, to ask these kinds of questions, to provide listeners access to important thinkers and stuff like that. David has been hustling his ass off in academia for many years, right? A place where the tenured track kind of comfortable life is all but a artifact of a bygone past. Right. And so I do want to kind of underscore there, for everyone listening, go subscribe to the Nostalgia Trap, subscribe to No Easy Answers, give financial support to the people whose work you depend on. B, it also makes it all the more fucking impressive that David got his book edited and published the way that he did out of the dissertation form, because I've thought of doing that. And the very thought of going back to that thing and updating it for an audience, making it readable for people who aren't my four academic advisors, that sounds like hell on fucking earth to me. And so, people should go read David's book. You're not going to be able to read my dissertation, nor would you really want to. But there is, I think, the reason I bring it up is there is a synergy there. And one of the reasons why I've always really appreciated David's work, his academic work on top of the podcasting, right, is my dissertation, as Jules, you may know, right, was on kind of the role of media in left politics in early 20th century Mexico, right? And so, I looked, in the first big chapter, I looked at, I guess for folks watching, you can see the mural behind me of Ricardo Flores Magón of the Partido Liberal Mexicano, famous Mexican anarchist who was one of the main kind of intellectual and political kind of precursors, and some argue even instigators of the Mexican Revolution over 100 years ago. I wrote a lot on Flores Magón, on the Partido Liberal Mexicano, and I focused on their newspaper, which was called Regeneración. Right, this was a newspaper that they started producing in Mexico. Then they kind of were forced into exile. They were chased around the U.S. by Pinkerton pieces of shit. But they produced this newspaper from Los Angeles for about a decade, constantly going in and out of jail. But it was such a vital part of that revolutionary foment for Ricardo and for everyone in and affiliated with the Partido Liberal Mexicano, right? They saw a real important value in keeping this newspaper going and in putting it together, right? And so the reason I'm bringing this up is to kind of establish a sort of framework for folks. One of the things that I tried to do in this piece was to show that if we just look at the newspaper itself, of Regeneración, right? We look at the articles. Even if we get close reading, we look at the typeface and stuff like that. There's only so much that can tell us. What you need to understand is what this medium did in the media environment that it existed in and circulated in at that time. And that is how you will understand, like why it was so politically important and what its connection was to the revolutionary activity happening along the border and deeper in Mexico. What I mean by that is that this was a core group of, Mexicans and some of their English-speaking comrades in the United States who were pumping this thing out. But this was before the internet, right? This was when, the Postal Service was their main, lifeline to other people. Or they used kind of clandestine networks. There's a great story of, the Partido Liberal Mexicano, the PLM, I'll call them, smuggling issues of Regeneración across the border. They took hollowed out Sears Roebuck catalogs and they stuffed, a bunch of newspapers in there. Or they they hopped off trains in the middle of the desert and met up with compañeros who would ride them into different towns and stuff like that. There was something really kind of vibrant and special and collective that made this newspaper possible. And it was also what Ricardo and everyone in Los Angeles depended on, because they were getting intel from people across Mexico. They were getting people writing in. It was subscriptions from all over the place that was keeping this thing afloat. But also, a lot of the activity happened in this kind of clandestine network of liberal clubs that had sprouted up across Mexico and even in parts of the Southwest United States. Like David's Coffeehouses, these were meeting spaces where not only like-minded people could come to talk about ideas that were dangerous to talk about in public or in mixed company, but also, as I argued in the dissertation, an essential part of the strategy at the time when Mexico's literacy rate was very low. This was a place where literate comrades could read aloud articles to Mexican workers. They could share that sort of information. Even the writing itself was meant to kind of be more mnemonically kind of approachable. The style of Ricardo when he writes is it's like a speechifying thing, right? Like if you remember that line, even if you can't read, it's going to stick in your brain. So anyway, won't go into the whole dissertation, but the point being is that I looked at media in this much more expansive way, right? Because all of these things that I just laid out constitutes what I would call media, right? Media being, going all the way back to the kind of Latin roots, the kind of connector point between two things that are separated, right? The sort of pathway, the connective tissue, the thing that brings together what is currently not together, right? Whether that be Mexican workers in a mining town in northern Mexico and Ricardo Flores Magón in Los Angeles, right? Through the Postal Service, through the railroad networks, through word of mouth, right? These are all media that make those connections possible, and that through those connections, revolutionary political action was thus also possible. So, did you have something to throw in there, David?
No. Go ahead.
So,
no, go ahead.
So then, let's take that and let's move forward into the 20th century, right? So, one of the things that David lays out beautifully in his book, right, is how these coffee houses, right, functioned in this sort of broader, what I would call media ecology, right? How many of those types of spaces were available, right? I mean, were you aware of who would be in there, what the kind of taken for granted social cues and dynamics were going to be, what sort of literature was going to be there, how were people going to make that literature, print it, distribute it, so on and so forth, right? Like they were material connector points that provided a sort of space for those ideas, for that camaraderie, to happen, right, in a sort of media landscape where you didn't have a whole lot else to mimic that, right? You either had TV, which was still kind of like in its early stages. You had radio, right? You did have obviously other underground kind of meeting spaces in different kind of political areas. The point being that when the sort of culture and the media ecology that supported it, right, had fewer spaces for that information to flow and for those connections to happen, right, it really amplifies the importance of having brick and mortar places like that, or publications like the ones that David talks about in his book, or publications like La Generación, right? It's like it's a voice in the wilderness kind of thing, right? It is something that is identifiable, that you can latch onto, that whose significance is amplified by its uniqueness almost. The situation 20, half a century later, in the 21st century is completely the opposite, right? Where now, as you both have mentioned, we live in a super saturated media ecology where it's the hard part is kind of finding people through the noise, right? And this was you even remember when the internet was kind of coming of age, a lot of the utopian dreams that were invested in the internet age were still kind of talking in that sort of vein. They were like, oh, it's going to allow people to connect around shared interests, to people who are not in their immediate vicinity. And it did, and it does, right? It does do that. But it's done a shit ton more, right? That has changed the way that we think and the way that we connect, to the point where there is so much content. There are so many ways to connect, and there are so many kind of algorithmic chambers and gateways that determine who we talk to, what we see, and who we don't see, and all that other stuff, right? That it really is kind of a garbled mess where there is no semblance of shared truth, and thus it's harder to kind of build a mass movement based on any sort of shared truth or shared principle in that, right? So, this is like, I'll sum it up this way, because Jodi Dean makes this point beautifully in her book. What is it? Democracy and Other Neoliberal Fantasies. It's a great book. Everyone should read it. But Jodi kind of points out that, like, there is a sort of ratio, right? When information is more limited, more scarce, right? Having that sort of access to independent media, right, counts for a whole hell of a lot more, right? Because it is identifiable. It is outside of the kind of permitted discourse, right? It is something that we have seen throughout history, be very important in that way. But now what you have is like a super saturation of options for people to choose, and it really makes it hard to build anything out of that isn't just kind of a collection of random pockets of people.
Yeah. And it makes me think of the value changing of the info. Like, there's more information now, and at some point people thought that was enough. Like, you could just reach in your pocket and all the information is just there. But it seems like the packaging of information is important, and the connection. You mentioned the coffeehouses and the newspaper and the movement that you're talking about in your dissertation, which you should put as an option on your Patreon, Max, for people that want to read it. Because I love that, and the idea that it's connected to a particular context and a particular set of people and place and movement, and even coffeehouses or other institutions where people go to and have more than just the information. In other words, like the information is connected to a culture and connected to a wider thing. I mean, for me, part of me thinks like we're in an opposite world as what I wrote about in the Coffeehouses, because it's so different in terms of accessing information now. But at the same time, part of me also thinks that information has always been a war and a battle, and that the weapons of that war have just changed and accelerated into the world we're in now. Because we see the way that like right-wing groups and QAnon, et cetera, use the information in ways that are strengthening their movement, and that are, in really, I think, ways that are unexpected to us, with misinformation and fake news and all that kind of thing. But, talking about the sort of how the media world has changed. I mean, I have stories in my book about the coffeehouse guys, guys and girls who are civilian activists and active duty GIs. When they got a mimeograph machine, which was like a pretty large machine, this was like a revolutionary thing for them to have, because they could print their own newspapers. And I think a lot of people take that for granted now. There are cases where the coffeehouses buried their mimeograph machines in the backyard behind the coffeehouse at night, because they knew that would be the item that vigilantes and others would want to, and the police, the FBI would want to destroy or confiscate from them. So, like, to me, like how vital it was that they have this machine, like the technological element of it, to be able to get their message out. So, Max, I'm glad you brought up context, because that it matters. It's not just kind of like media is this or that. It kind of functions in ways that I think we're still learning. I mean, we started this conversation, all of us, talking about getting started on podcasts. And I don't think, I mean, to me, like, I don't think any of us really know where this medium is going. It's a very new place, and we can see it like turn into something very commercial with, storytelling, true crime podcasts like Serial that like got into the multi-million-dollar range. We're like people who are trying to do something political. It's very different, right? Like, in other words, we're on the same channel, but we're trying to like kind of use the information in a different way and create a different sort of connection. I don't know. For me, part of me is really excited by that. And obviously I'm doing a podcast, so I believe something in it. But I also think, Max and Jules, I think this is an opportunity for us now to kind of think about like, okay, we have this. We can obviously reach people. What are we doing with it? Because I do see a sort of half and half thing where, and I include myself in it, where you're sort of like marketing a podcast. At the same time, you're trying to create content that creates meaningful conversations. And those two impulses can often be at odds in a culture that's very clickbaity, that's very sort of like sensational. It's in many ways like it's weird because we're just ordinary people that don't work for major media organizations, but we're sort of competing with them in a weird world. And that part of it has changed. That's pretty significant. The idea that like the underground folks are sort of on the same channel as the big accounts, and we're all swinging at each other. It's a chaotic moment. It really is. No easy answers is I think the right way to sort of respond to the media question, because that's part of what I like to talk about on Nostalgia Trap is what exactly are we in the midst of? Because we're in the midst of something shifting dramatically, but none of us really knows where that's going. It's like, I don't know if you guys watched the QAnon documentary, but this sort of like this giggly feeling of like, oh, it's fun that things are changing so quickly, but there's also the feeling of like, holy shit, like Nazis are organizing online, and they're doing it by like using all sorts of like weird, twisted cartoons and shit. I mean, it's a sci-fi world in a lot of ways, and that part of it is sort of indicates to me that people are weird. The story of the world is weird, and technology has now created and amplified that weirdness into a public sphere at a level that it never has before. So part of me is just kind of like, I don't know, overwhelmed by everything that's going on. And I think that's a common feeling. I think that's like a common sort of, I don't know, place to be in our age, is to be overwhelmed. And that probably explains a lot of the chaos too. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I feel. It's like constantly treading water in the permanent now, right? Like there is no, I don't know when it happened, but at some point, in my life, and I feel like it was in the past decade. Like I remember saying this on another show a while back. It's like I lament and I mourn the loss of the ability to feel bored. Like if in those spaces when I used to feel bored, I now feel anxious, right? I now feel overwhelmed. I now feel a constant gnawing sense in the back of my head of the connections I should be making, the communications I should be using this time to do, right? The tasks I should be using this time to do, right? And like, I think you're right, David, that has become, and media has been a major instigator of making that a generalized feeling for us. And there's something really, important there that has done to politics. That has, I think, what made Trump successful in 2016 and beyond, right, is very much linked to that. I remember trying to flesh that thesis out for like the Boston Review and the Baffler. I haven't read them in a long time, but like there is something about what Trump gave people, the kind of cachet that he had and his ability to swim in these waters, that made him way more of an effective politician than a lot of the old guard Republicans who he knocked out in 2016 were. But I guess like to tie that quickly back to my answer to your previous question, Jules, because I'm glad that David followed that up, because I in a lot of ways buried the lead, right? Because I guess like for listeners, the obvious kind of context here, or maybe not so obvious, so I apologize for not saying it, right, is that talking about, right, yeah, like the importance of the underground, what the underground actually meant when you had an above ground that was dominated, that was mainstream, and that was restricted, right? That war over information was very restricted, like at that time, right? People like us were not getting on, like on TV, right? And, ever since the 20s and 30s, right, that same process by which government has helped industry consolidate its power, both in terms of limiting radio bandwidth and prioritizing that bandwidth for the bigger, more well-funded stations, who then parlayed that into kind of being at the forefront of the TV revolution, right? Who then in the 90s, got this major gift where media companies started consolidating more and more than ever before. Right? Like that's the above ground that we're talking about. That is the kind of mainstream corporate media that has had such a stranglehold on our own historical consciousness, our own political discourse, and also essentially what David just meant, our ability to participate in it in any semblance or any way possible. Like this is another thing that is kind of weird to communicate to people who have only known this world. And I think most of us who have now learned to swim in it have kind of forgotten how significant this change was. But just the thought that you could now pull out your phone and yell at a politician and potentially elicit a response from them, let alone kind of catalyze or participate in some sort of social activity that could result in someone resigning from a powerful position, right? Or even having to address the concerns that people are vocalizing. That did not exist in most realms of life, right? Unless you were, going to throw a pie in a politician's face, right? It was very limited. But that underground that was facilitated by the kind of people that Dave was talking about, by the kind of machinery that they were burying in the backyard, there is a reason why the people who wanted to squash those underground movements wanted to take out their means of communication, right? Because that was, before the internet, the way that you could, massify or popularize to some extent these kind of ideas that were outside of the permitted zeitgeist. Okay, I'll shut up now.
The one response I would have to that, Max, is thinking about Trump's appeal and sort of how my dad just texted me today and said, "Do you know what Trump is doing on 9/11? All the other major figures like George W. Bush, Clinton, all the other former presidents, they're all going to be doing 9/11 memorials, and Donald Trump is hosting like a celebrity boxing match in Florida." And look at the smiles. Everyone laughs. See, like, look at the fucking power of that, because I laughed when I heard that, and my dad did not laugh. My dad was like, can you believe how disrespectful that is? And I thought to myself, yeah, but the fact that millions and millions of people are going to laugh when they hear that, to me, like, it indicates that what we talked about in this conversation, right? That like sort of knee-jerk patriotism around war and things like 9/11, the response to 9/11 has been so dark and so cynical in the 20 years since that a sizable portion of the American public looks at anything like 9/11 and just says, who the fuck cares? I don't care. It has nothing to do with me. Like, you have to understand like how deeply broken the national story must be for so many Americans to have that attitude. And it is also like, it means that like some sort of like hokey patriotism that like this bipartisan thing of like the Bushes and the Clintons are trying to do just isn't as operative as it used to be. And it's not as operative to the right, which is really interesting to me. Like the right wing is like saying, no, I'm actually with Trump at the boxing match. Like that's what real America is doing that night. Fuck 9/11. Who cares? You're kind of like, that's amazing, because when Trump made fun of John McCain and said, oh, like I respect people that don't get caught, people said, well, that's it for him. He'll never. In other words, there was this assumption that like that kind of patriotism was so strong in America that if you deviated from it at all, you would be done as a national candidate. But Trump is like, I'm doing a celebrity boxing match on 9/11. Fuck you. And a big portion of America sees that as in line with their values and in line with who they are. That's a pretty dramatic shift, I think. And one that, again, I don't know where that's headed, but the media part of it is an important part of it. Like the sort of like meme culture and the sort of like, I don't know, the South Parkification of culture in a way. And I don't want to like blame any of those cultural things because I don't think that way. But I feel like there has been a shift in a more cynical, almost funny attitude, like dark funny, like Trump functions as a dark comedian. And that somehow fits the tone of our age. And I will admit that it does feel like a black comedy. America does feel like a black comedy. It just, to me, like the way that fascism gets in through the door is through like kind of jokey, humorous nihilism. We sort of shit post our way to fascism. And that to me seems like it's part of that. And again, looking at the way that this stuff functioned in the 60s, it's a really, really different moment, but there was a sense of like, I don't know, the counterculture gaming the system in some way. And that was a very left oriented thing. The like pranking of the yippies and creating like subversive cultural moments seems like the right can do that now too. And the right can achieve power through kind of creating that counterculture. And that to me is a development I didn't anticipate. Like when I first started doing my dissertation, I was young in graduate school, I just thought, well, the counterculture is like this left wing sort of thing. But I've thought a lot now about like what we really mean by counterculture, because hearing you talk, Max, about like the above ground and how much media companies have consolidated their power in our lifetime and become these mega corporations that control everything. At the same moment, people gain access to technology that allows them to have a voice in that culture like never before, and yet we're still very much controlled by that. I mean, Trump has been kicked off of Twitter, etc. There's a sort of weird feeling that like we're I don't think any of the ideas about like what free speech online and what speech is online have been settled at all. I mean, we're on company time when we're tweeting and stuff like that, and so that to me is just very far from what the vision would have been even of 60s revolutionaries. If you ask them like, hey, would you see it as revolutionary to be on a big corporate channel like that? I think you'd get like a lot of conflicted answers if that's progress or not.
Yeah, I think it's really generative what you guys are saying, man. And I'm trying to choose just a couple of the things you guys mentioned here. It's really wonderful stuff. All of this kind of begs this sort of, David, on your I keep pointing out stuff from your recent shows, but like there was something there recent that was like reality is illegible, and like and I tend to think of this as almost in like a choose your own reality sort of thing. Like you mentioned I did hear about the Trump going to a boxing match thing on 9/11, but I also heard that he was recently attending funerals of dead soldiers, and then the headline or somebody who pointed that out was like, and Biden's not even doing this. So it's like a person who is really looking to have a favorable view of all of this, is probably going to remember that as opposed to him going to a boxing match, or at least like, in the choose your own reality. What is reality? There's no, truth anymore. They can kind of just, 2 + 2 = whatever they want it to be. Right. At that point, So, speaking of reality being illegible, I mean, something that I've mentioned before is that, like, we live in a tarnished history, and that, like, in a way that, we have so many things in history that are, like, shown to be true conspiracies over time, but yet, like, people, it's really difficult to talk about American history in a historically accurate way without coming off as like a ufologist at times. It's very easy to slip into conspiracy territory. And again, it goes back to this reality is not legible thing, or choose your own reality. But, for those of us who have watched 9/11 and had this sort of driving curiosity to decipher the world and why that happened and what the geopolitical aspects of that were, and what does the Afghanistan war mean? Where are these historical parallels? All these big questions we're tangling with, man. In the same way we started this conversation out talking about the characterization of the historical memory and the CCR in Vietnam, I'm getting this vibe out of media now where they're like, actually, the true story behind 9/11 happened in the 80s or in the end of the 70s when we were funding the Mujahideen to try and make the Soviet Union fall. And it's almost like this, hey, cue the rock music, we're going to tell you the background history in a cool sort of documentary sort of way about these things that, like, if you had said, hey, man, Operation Cyclone and Zbigniew Brzezinski back, previous to this, I mean, I think, in a way, people would kind of just, because there's such a prevalence of conspiracy theories and shit in society that they might just lump you into that group. And so I wonder, Max, if you're getting this, and one other thing I wanted to add to that as well is that, like, one thing it come to my attention, if you look up the Wikipedia page for Mika Brzezinski, she was the Ground Zero reporter on that day, apparently on CBS. Oddly enough, I've never been able to find any footage of that stuff. But it's got to be some sick, twisted joke that Mika Brzezinski, the daughter of Zbigniew, is like the Ground Zero reporter on that day. It's just, anyway, so making those connections, it's part of what, like, it makes you end up sounding like a ufologist at the end of the day when you notice all these different connections. So I'm wondering, Max, do you see us, like, well, I guess I don't even know where the question is. I'm going to regroup for a second here and edit that part out.
So I mean, it doesn't even need to be framed as a question, right? Like I'm itching to hop in here. I just wanted to see if there was anything else that you had to add. Because I'm over here like, okay, I got 10 things I want to thread together.
Well, thread those together, man. Because part of the reason why I wanted to have you guys on was, one is I know you notice these parallels as well. You're both historians, but also Max's studies on media and your. I mean, it's a great. I love having you guys just kind of respond back and forth to each other. It's wonderful, and that's part of why I wanted to bring you two together on this. So, Max, what do you got, man?
I appreciate it, man.
Tell us about reality, Max.
Okay, well, it's like, I think that, you mentioned, David, that it was going to happen some point. So we're going to tread into postmodernism at some point in this tirade, right? But to make the point kind of clear for folks, right? And to really underscore this choose your own reality kind of carnival-esque world that we're living in, it makes me think, right, about the kind of age-old, philosophical question that every high kid in a college dorm inevitably asks at one point or another, right? When you're lying on the floor with your roommate and you're like, bro, how do I know that what I see as red is what you see as red, right? What if we're seeing two completely different things, right? What human beings I imagine people have been asking this version of this question since we learned how to talk, right? There is some sort of fascination with the fact that as human beings limited to the bodies and selves that we have, you are never fully able or enabled to see the world outside of your own head, right? Or you can never verify, right? Our heads could be literally, an inch away, but what is on the other side of each person's forehead is galaxies away, right? And again, we could be thinking about the exact same fucking thing.
This is definitely the edible, by the way.
This is the edible kicking in, right? The thing that fascinates us, the thing that puzzles us so much is that I can never verify, what is going on in the other person's head, right? And so we turn that kind of, lack of knowledge into kind of this expanding universe of what ifs, right? So, I took this detour because I know that on No Easy Answers, you engage with a lot of philosophy and your listeners love to think about this stuff, right? It was, I believe, Wittgenstein who kind of offered like a definitive answer to this conundrum, right? He was like, the answer does not lie in the other person's head, right? The verifiable truth is in the fact that if I say red and you both point to the same thing, it is the kind of social rules that you're both abiding by that verify the truth of what you're seeing, right? And so I bring that up, right? Because that is, I think, what has enabled, right, this explosion of communities of deferring truth when we're all supposedly living and stewing in the same reality, but have vastly different understandings of the truth of that reality, right? It's not just that we are, there have been, like you said, UFO, conspiracy theorists and stuff who have been thinking this stuff in their own trailers, but did not have other people to really kind of verify that truth to build any semblance of shared community founded on that kind of truth. So they were the kind of wackos, right? And their truth existed outside of the verifiable one that, we could see and agree upon, based on again, those external sort of rules that, judge that keep that reality sort of consistent. What has, again, kind of really changed, or I guess really been amplified in the digital age, right, is the ability to secure and cocoon yourself in communities that repeat back the truth that you believe, right? And therein, that has kind of created something that humanity, as we in the United States and our kind of political shit show that we've been living through, humanity is not ready to handle that yet. It doesn't know how to handle that, right? There have always been ways that, people have sort of muscled out folks who have different views of reality, right? But we now, with that kind of QAnon stuff, with, so much of our political discourse being kind of people talking past each other, having no real kind of common agreed upon foundations, right? It creates this sort of, mess that if you're looking from an aerial view, right, it's just all these sort of different blobs kind of going at each other, but really kind of afforded the ability to stay in those sort of self-contained walls and to have, to be living the truth that reality is what other people confirm for you, right? And this, I think, actually connects. I'm gonna try to kind of tie this together with some of the other things that we've got on the table, because we obviously started talking about the reality of war, and what sort of shared sense of reality do we actually have? Well, as David mentioned earlier, and as you picked up on, Jules, part of the imperial project of the American military-industrial complex has been to derealize the reality of war, in many different ways, to distance us from it, to obscure it from view, and to obviously, lie about it to the public, right? But one of the questions that, we had talked about possibly discussing, right, was, what significance it had for the American empire when the draft ended in 1972, right? It untethered, right, in a really significant way, right, that sort of shared sense of what the reality of war meant. As we all know, it was not shared, like equally across class or racial lines, right? But it was still, again, something there external that impacted, you, your neighbors, your family, people around you. It was something that was there that impacted your lives, right? It was part of the reality that you yourself lived. When that tie was severed, this kind of process began that we're now sitting, 50 years afterwards. The draft is not there. And so much of the, war itself is mediated to us through, the military industrial complex and, the outlets in the corporate media that just kind of regurgitate whatever the fuck, military generals say. But also, at that same time, as we've seen across the 20 years in the war of Afghanistan, right? One of the things that really struck me, and one of the reasons why I think it's so unreal to so many of people, right, is not only because there's not a draft, but also because of the people who are actually over there, right? Daniel Hale, the whistleblower who was just, sentenced to prison for doing a public service of leaking important documents about the U.S. drone program and so on and so forth, wrote in his letter to the judge that he's like, I became disillusioned when I looked around me and I realized that military contractors outnumbered us 3-1 on the ground. Right. So it was people. Again, it's not your neighbor who's getting enlisted to go fight this sort of war that you're barely even seeing on the TV or on your internet feed. Right. It is people who are going there with a targeted, profit driven purpose. Right. That really exists like outside of this kind of, shared realm of civil society. Right. So I guess before I, pile on more shit to that, does that like connection at least hold up to some degree?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think it's something that I would have laughed at, honestly, years ago, the breakdown of civil society but the way you're describing it, the way you're characterizing civil society is so different than I think a lot of people tend to think of civility as just sort of like politeness or something, but you're characterizing sort of an element of a shared understanding that I think is an important part of this. So yes, I do. I'm totally on board.
So then, comes in the postmodernism thing, right? And I will try to triple Lindy this onto David's fascism point. That's what I am. I'm Rodney Dangerfield, just jumping from board to board right now. So, where postmodernism comes into this, right, is like, what we know about postmodernism in broad strokes, right, is that it is supposedly the kind of social, cultural, political phenomenon that occurs, right, when the quote unquote meta narratives that secured that shared sense of reality, even if by force, right? Secured meta narratives about America, about the nuclear family, right? About God, the existence of God, right? For folks listening, what we're, I guess, talking about, right, is that the break from modernity to postmodernity was essentially kind of a loss of faith that government is good and is there to serve the people, right? That America is on this kind of inevitable path to progress.
To me, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. You're the postmodernist expert, Max. But to me, it's like all of a sudden 2 + 2. We're not so sure it equals 4. Postmodernism introduces this idea that maybe 2 + 2 = 5. And that sort of like certainty, if that makes sense, that like rational certainty about facts and science and even just like the meaning of words themselves is something that postmodernism allegedly breaks apart, right?
Yeah, I mean that's what it really. That's how I've always understood it, right?
Yeah.
Is the breaking, right? And it breaks in a number of different realms, right? It's where there was once an externally secured source of truth that could verify for you that that yes, America was good. Yes, this government was good. Yes, God exists, and therefore that gives meaning to this, this, and this, right? When those central pillars that held up, those central pillars of truth that held up the shared sense of reality are broken, right? Then, like where that truth comes from, what role it plays in one's politics or one's, like culture, that all really starts to change. And you start, to David's point, using very different metrics and standards to judge what is true and what is not. Right. And so I guess for listeners, like to not get too deep in the weeds, the point being, right, is that if we understand that shift from modernism to postmodernism to be at least some way linked to that kind of destruction of the pillars that held up shared senses of truth on a mass scale, right, then you have this sort of explosion that catalyzes, this process whereby people are going to start making meaning out of the world that they live in, based on other things, right? Not based on just kind of what the church tells them, not based on taking what the government is saying at face value, right? Something like the lies that led to the war in Vietnam, that's going to break your faith that in fact the government, like is always telling the truth. That's something that I've seen myself. Like when I remember going to jury duty once, and it was the person on trial was a fucking cop, and the question that the prosecution asked every one of the jurors was like, would you have a problem believing that a cop was not telling the truth or like could commit something? And I saw old person after old person say, I would have a problem with that. I can't do it. I always think that cops are telling the truth, right? That was before, that was maybe like 10 years ago, right? Before Black Lives Matter, before like, what we've seen. And now I think a lot of that faith in the police as an institution and the truthfulness that with which they comport themselves, right? A lot of that is broken. So hopefully that gives like a little example of what I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
The reason that I bring all this up, right, is that again, if we add that to the fucking sauce of everything that we were talking about before, especially in the digital age, right, where you are super saturated with information, you are presented with an overabundance of means of communicating and forming kind of groups and shared groups of truth, affiliation groups, what have you. Then the algorithms kick in and start limiting more and more of who you see and what you see and yada yada yada. Right, all of this starts feeding on each other. All these things start feeding on each other, right, to create that sort of pick your own reality thing. Right, all the conditions are there to not only destroy the kind of few past pillars of truth, to not only enable people to form these sorts of communities in different ways that they couldn't in the 20th century, but tying it all back to the fascism question. The reason why that has made someone like Trump, be able to do what he does, the way that has given rise to this kind of, increasingly fascistic feeling in the country that is actually gaining, way more sympathies than any of us would want, right? It goes back to something that I think that Jeff Ely, one of my historian advisors at the University of Michigan, I thought put really well, right? He put that fascism isn't just kind of like something that, it's not something that you have to have a perfect historical recipe for which the ingredients only existed, in the 1920s and 1930s in a specific part of the world. He said one of the essential conditions for fascistic politics to grow is people losing faith in democratic governance, in the ability of governmental institutions to not only preserve democracy, but also the belief that democracy is the correct form of social governance, right? And so that is like what Jeff saw in 2016. And I think it was because of all these different things that we're talking about, right? The longer, the more disaffected we become, the more our media allow us to kind of like, recede farther into these competing visions of truth, right? The more that sort of postmodernist kind of process eats us internally, right? We do develop this kind of cynicism masquerading as humor, right? That ultimately, as David said, has the cumulative effect of at least breaking us away from the belief that democratic governance is good and that the existing institutions of government are what are going to deliver that to us. And so fascism doesn't necessarily result from that, but it does unmoor enough people from, that shared sense of reality and from that shared sense of belief in the existing kind of social system that some version of fascism, when you combine all the other social, political, economic conditions that make people amenable to a politics like that, can grow.
Super scary. Super scary, Max, because it's what you put together is sort of like, I don't know, it's something I think about a lot. That's sort of like, and I don't know if this is right, but it feels like it maybe just because we're in the opening years of it, but the chaos of digital media benefits fascists, benefits the right, like creates a sort of template in which the exact kind of breaks you're describing can happen. That sounds like a really panicked, weird way of like being like a liberal, like, and saying like, well, this internet has made things as unmoored us from the powers that be, and that it's crumbling our society. And I don't know, the young person in me, the young like stoned radical kid, is like, well, that's good. Like maybe that's a good thing. Like maybe that we can see some justice in this world if we somehow disrupt the power systems that have created an unjust world. That seems pretty logical to me. But I also see now that same impulse is one that is like the people on January 6th who are basically like, I don't believe in democracy anymore. Like I believe in smashing shit to get what I want. And like that's fascism to me. And that's something that is kind of the challenge of the future for us. I mean, to figure out what exactly this media landscape is and how it might be sort of used to a different set of values and ideas than the direction it's headed. Does that make sense? Like sort of our challenge. I mean, it's a really ambitious one. But I only say that because like I started Nostalgia Trap so many years ago without any ambition other than just like share some stuff online. And in the years since, I've watched this like industry of like left podcasts, and other political persuasions as well. But to see that like rise up and all of a sudden be like this industry where like there are people that are making shitloads of money being like left podcasters, right? And I'm talking like tons of money, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars a year being left podcasters. And I'm like, that's a different game than like the people that were at at the GI coffeehouses during the Vietnam War. These people were not putting out underground newspapers that were making them $100,000 on a Patreon or Substack every month. They were putting out stuff that made them zero money and actually bankrupted them and ended them in jail. So like that landscape is really, really different. And I guess what I'm saying is that there was a degree of risk involved that now the risk is like, will my Patreon, keep the same amount of money that it's pumping me every month? And like that part of it is a really weird thing because, in the same landscape as the left podcasters that are making millions of dollars are like these little podcasts that are doing it for like nothing and doing it for a different purpose, it almost seems. And like, I don't want to call anybody out because I think I love the fact that there's a left industry of podcasts. And that's not what I bring this up. I bring this up to more be like your point, Max, earlier, which is sort of like, well, what are we doing with all this now? Like, okay, we have we obviously like there are stories in mainstream media about left podcasts having a voice in the world. So like, what does that mean? Because it seems like for 4 years it was about Bernie Sanders, and like that project is gone in a way, or at least is not really the project as much anymore. So now it's, I think, a different role for the left, and it's a different moment in a media way too. And again, no easy answers, Jules. But it does seem like, I don't know, as someone who has been in this world for a while, sort of seeing, how we're all creating content and getting it listened to, and some of us making money off of it. There's sort of the feeling of like, all right, what's the next step? At least that's what I'm trying to think through. Kind of what's the next kind of like, what's the next sort of step in that journey of creating a media that changes the conversation in ways beyond just getting more content for people to listen to? Because, it's just a stew after a while. But I think I don't know. I'm optimistic enough to see potential in it. And to see potential in it that's beyond just what we're doing now. But I don't know what that mean, what that might mean, or what that might look like.
Max, I want to take us back to your how do we know that red is red and blue is blue at the start of the edible? Because you bring up something that like I've noticed more and more, and that comes to my mind quite a bit now as I try to decipher the world, and it's like this appeal to like conventionalist notions that like the sound that comes out of my mouth that represents a word is not completely arbitrary. Like that sound that you and I agree is for house or for cat or whatever, that is there and given value because of the social sphere giving that value, right? And so, when I think about like when you talked about knowledge and mediums and things, I think all knowledge on some reducible level is like based off of trust, is based on like if I asked you if the moon is round or if the moon is a sphere, you'd be like, yeah, it's a sphere. And I'd be like, well, who told you that? And be like, your teacher. Well, who told your teacher that? And at some point, it's like it's all based on human to human trust that what I'm telling you is true, and you can take that and operate by it. And so when you talk about like when we talk about the illegibility of reality and things in the social sphere and how people try to find meaning, I think it's a little bit, it's kind of worse than like choose your own reality. Because like, what happens if like if a teacher tells the kid the earth is flat? I mean, we have teachers, we have people in positions of authority who are not subscribing to the same realities as you and I, that we entrust different valuable parts of our lives, whether it's our children or our jobs or whatever. Like reality is so scattered at this point that we have, it's hard to go about your day without we're probably encountering people with all sorts of crazy alternative subscriptions to reality. And just want to get a cup of coffee or something.
Isn't that the vaccine? I mean, isn't that bringing that question into like clarity in a way that we haven't really seen before? Which is like the vaccine is a basic question. It's basically like, do you believe that this is really a vaccine that can deal with COVID, or do you not? And by saying no, you're saying something pretty profound. It's saying that you reject the entirety of the scientific establishment. I mean, and yet to me, like, it's such a normal thing. It's just like rejecting climate change. That's just a normal position in America. You can say, nope, I don't believe in that. So like that reality, like a choosing of reality, has real political consequences and like biological consequences. I mean, we have to say that lots of people are going to die because people aren't taking vaccinations, like a lot of people. And that to me is like, I don't know. Max, you and I, we talked at the beginning of COVID, and I remember you and I saying like this has the potential to accelerate a lot of really ugly trends in American life. And it's been really, I mean, to me, like even more so than I even anticipated. And part of it is that reality thing, which is that, yeah, you do get to choose your own reality, but it's also seems chosen for you in a sense. Like all the people, my dad pointed out today, I talk about my dad all the time because he's always freaking out about the Trump people in town. They're all the same people that were on the corner with the Make America Great Again are the same people that are now on the corner with no vaccines. It's the same people. I mean, it's a small town. I'm like, there's that dude, there's that dude, there's that dude. I know these guys, I know their trucks, etc. So it's like, how much is it to choose your own reality, and how much is it like, I just don't believe in the vaccine because Trump said it. Because Trump said not to. You know what I mean? Like that to me is even, how much is it choosing your own reality, and how much is it just accepting the reality that's been handed to you by your demagogue? And that seems like what part of what's going on as well. It's not just like an open field where we all just choose whatever. It's still major powerful figures and corporations, etc., that are sort of shuffling us into I believe in the vaccine or I do not believe in the vaccine. And I think it's very easy for a lot of Americans to feel like one of the points that we made on the 9/11 thing is that imperial citizens or imperial societies create citizens that like to think of themselves as exceptional and like to think of themselves as very smart because they live in the empire. Americans think of themselves as genuinely better than everyone else. I mean, I think that's part of our ideology. So that kind of has a contradiction within an empire because they're also going to think they're smarter than their own government. And so you have a bunch of people who are like, I'm special, and I know better, and I don't buy this bullshit. And I'm not cucked by the liberals who are telling me to get a vaccine or wear a mask. I'm actually better and smarter than that. I don't buy that bullshit. It's a point of pride. Like I don't buy what you buy. And there's something really powerful to that in a society that really values the smart, brilliant individual American. And that's the only kind of value a person can have is to be exceptional in some way. Like we don't create a society that's about solidarity with each other or responsibility to each other. We have a society that's entirely about like your own ability to rise by your own talents. And that's going to lead to people saying, I don't buy this bullshit. I'm not taking any vaccine. I'm a rugged individual who doesn't need that shit. And that to me is like 100% out of, it's a new moment, but at the same time, it's not a new moment at all. This is how settler colonial people fucking react to being asked to sacrifice for others. Is they just don't. I mean,
you just trigger something for me here, brother. Like the depth of like American psychosis. In a way, I think of it as I'm talking to two historians here, right? Is like an extension of like the Reformation and Enlightenment by way of like if you are turning towards reason and then somebody says, hey, you don't need the priest to like interpret these scriptures for you anymore. You can interpret them yourselves. There's a certain amount of like, confidence one has to, or sort of curation or sort of encouraging that sort of, yeah.
Young people today are like, some of them will just repeat like, oh, you don't need to go to college. You can just watch YouTube videos. And it's like,
right.
Can you though? Like I'm enough of an old school, like academic type person that would think, no, I actually believe in the process of like reading something together and exchanging information and not just like watching a YouTube video as any kind of intellectual practice. Like that's insane to me. And yet there is a lot of people like will just share a YouTube video as learning. Like it's just like, hey, where did you learn this? Oh, this video, here it is. And now you know it. Yeah, I sound like so old fashioned now when I'm thinking about education, but like part of this is like really made me think a lot about that. Like what is the value of college? What is the value of school? How is it different than learning something online? I think that's part of our future sort of project as well, is sort of like, what is school? And how does it make sense in this environment? Because all the things we've brought up, I think are things that ought to be answered by an education system. But, what's happening in education is, something that's a whole other conversation.
Well, and like, I definitely get what you're saying, David, is like you almost feel, like an old fart kind of talking about these things. But I mean, it's something that
who believes in truth anymore?
Right. Right. Does no one believe in truth anymore?
Yeah.
Well, it's something that is happening, like you said, it's happening in academia, it's happening in government, it's happening in media, right? We are watching it unfold and in a very kind of peculiar way, right? Like you said, like the lefty in me, the younger person in me, the person who believes in the value of independent media has been watching, right? These kind of increasingly more high profile kind of battles between individual kind of personalities who are establishing themselves as independent media makers. And I'm talking about like the Glenn Greenwalds, the Matt Taibbi's of the world, the people who have, a product to sell in their Substack, Jimmy fucking Dore, whatever, right? Like what I have seen, right, initially was like, oh, okay, so these are people who are leaving, the mainstream media sphere or the institutional media sphere, maybe I would call it, for this kind of independent media sphere that I also occupy. So sure, why not? We got a lot of people here. It's a big pool, plenty of room to swim. So I was thinking, but now what I've seen, especially as someone who's kind of like straddling that, like from on the real news side, right? I have, and before that I was at the Chronicle, right? I was like, okay, well, like these institutions have value because of the people who are there, the expertise that they bring, the fact checking that they do, the quality control, right? Like there is something very valuable to having that institution that I think really serves kind of the mission of making truthful and principled media, yada yada yada. And so what I've seen, and Glenn Greenwald is like among the worst people of this, but he's by no means the only one, but is they're very much trying to kind of burn the house down on their way out, right? Because they have a vested interest in burning the house down on their way out. And what they're doing is they're really telling people, right, like, that the institution itself is the evil, right? And only I, in that sort of rugged individualist like way, like will have the capacity to tell you the unvarnished truth. Yeah. And again, at the outset of it, I was like, okay, whatever. I assume everyone understands that, like, well, you have to say this because you were trying to build up a readership and a donor base that is going to like pay your bills. So hopefully everyone at least acknowledges it's like, okay, yeah, he's got to shit on, that institution so that he can kind of draw for readers. But now I'm looking around, I'm seeing like, well, fuck, everyone's buying this. Like, or more and more people are buying this, and more it is kind of like turning into this sort of attack towards any form of, like institution-based media, which is really, it really fucking pisses me off, as the editor-in-chief.
And while Glenn Greenwald is on Fox News with Tucker Carlson every night, you know what I mean? Like, to me, like the hypocrisy of that is just so blatant. I mean, his turn is one that I think, and I don't want to make this all about Glenn Greenwald, but because I think it's something that it's common on that within that element of the left media sphere is like, like hating neoliberals so much that you become a guy that's on Tucker Carlson every night saying, nodding your head along with him while he's saying vaccines are fake or whatever. Like the shit that, in other words, the connection with the sort of populist streak that is the right populism is something that's immensely troubling. And you're right. I mean, I know Glenn's like building a brand and everything like that, but at the same time, it's like he's building a brand that is sort of falling into, just being on the right all the time. Like, I don't see him really as a leftist at all anymore.
Well, I don't know if he ever conundrum.
Was. Yeah.
No, that's the conundrum that I'm trying to, like, in a long-winded way, trying to kind of pinpoint, right? Is that in that sort of postmodern way, that you can move that quickly from ostensibly being on the left to being on the right, because you are being the thing that is propelling you is not principle, right? But rather, right, kind of affiliation, right? You run towards the people who accept you and who repeat back to you the truth of the reality that you want to believe that you're living in, right?
And that will melt your mind. And if you want any evidence of that, go over to Glenn Greenwald's Twitter feed at any moment and just see a melted mind, because the guy doesn't make sense to me anymore. And to me, I hear the like medium is the message thing a little bit too, which is like when you see a Glenn Greenwald on Fox News, people who don't pay much attention, they're like, well, a left-wing guy goes on Fox News and talks about this and nods his head along with Tucker Carlson. So it like gives a kind of validation to it. And I think that's actually the most profound meaning of what he's done, more than any of like the detailed policy stuff he talks about. He just like kind of gives validation to that perspective by being there in a suit, nodding along with it. And that's super troubling. Yeah, fuck that guy.
No, and the again, the postmodern dynamic here to try to make concrete like all the theoretical stuff we were talking about, right, is like, this is what it looks like when politics starts to arrange, and I have another point to make on this in a second, but when politics is really propelled by these sort of just kind of like purely positional and oppositional forces. Like you said, like what has driven someone like Glenn Greenwald to where he is hatred for neoliberals, his hatred for, this or that person, which pushes him almost like hockey pucks on ice, right? They're not stakes driven into the ground based on some sort of principled commitment to truth, justice, and so on and so forth, right? It really is kind of this frictionless movement that is based on, I want to be independent. So who can I like push against as the establishment right now, right? And that includes, like for someone like Glenn Greenwald, it sadly includes like basically everyone who, is working at kind of a media institution. And it's leading a lot of people to associate any type of institution in that vein, or, any institution that they selectively group in that, category as the inherent evil that doesn't need to be listened to, that's chock filled with lies, so on and so forth. The reason I mentioned that is because it's similar and to the dynamics you were talking about, David, where, we're seeing people who are so driven by an aversion to what the government tells them, and who have learned over a lifetime to be mistrustful of corporations that are always trying to squeeze something out of us and face no accountability when things go wrong, like if a product gives us fucking cancer or what have you, right? We have developed, I think, a trained and in a lot of ways good or potentially good mistrust, right? In that postmodern vein of governments that have fucking lied to us over and over again to get us into war after war. Like, I remember thinking, you mentioned your dad. I was thinking about my dad. I love watching UFO shows with him for a number of reasons. One, it's just a lot of fun. Two, we just kind of start talking about stuff. But, as a, longtime conservative, a lifelong conservative for him until very recently, right? He had like a lot of that sort of faith in the government. You add to that the sort of immigrant sort of faith in the U.S. government, right, as the arbiter of the good and the just and so on and so forth. Like, UFOs and the alien stuff was like the one realm where he was like, oh, the government's not telling us something. Right. Or like, they're lying to us about this or that. Right. It was a arena of thought that allowed him to question the authority, the truth kind of telling authority of the government. And so like, that's what makes all of this so fucking tragic in a lot of ways. Right. Is that what we're describing is very close to what we need it to be, right? It is good and healthy for a left populist, like working class based movement to have that sort of skepticism about, a capitalist economy and a government that serves it, right? It is good to have that sort of authority, streak in you, right? It is, there's a very, I think, essential democratic impulse there that we can cultivate, and that I still like to believe that we can cultivate. But here's where I kind of end up at the larger point, because I think everything that you were saying, David, makes total sense. I guess the one piece of context I would add for listeners, right, is that we're also talking about these things while the larger, more obvious evils that have shaped our world, like everything that we're talking about, has allowed all the other evil shit to really take hold, right? Like, who are the other institutions and people who have had a vested interest in sowing doubt among citizens and consumers about things like climate change, right? People who have, a vested interest in making you doubt the truth that you're being told on the TV or in the newspaper or by a government official, right? Who are the people on right-wing radio for fucking decades who have been telling you, like, no matter what it is, if a if a person with D next to their name is talking to you on the TV, they're lying, right? You do that so much, you build that kind of knee-jerk aversion that we're seeing in action right now with people who are so willing to take fucking horse paste to like cure this virus. Because the people in their shared like oppositional community of truth are reflecting that back to them. And because the arbiters of truth, whether that be the scientific community, whether that be, pharmaceutical companies or the government, right, have been tarnished so much that like the opposite can only be possible in that way. So all those other forces that have been working on us for decades have like really, I think we're seeing now, what happens when, we become increasingly unmoored from any other left movement or sense of community, right? And if we are those hockey pucks floating on the surface, then the strongest social forces that are coming from, big business, that are coming from the surveillance state and so on and so forth, we're seeing, like what society looks like when those things kind of push people where they want.
This has been a great conversation, man. I was really happy to have you guys. Thanks for being on the show. Before we let everybody go, will you tell everyone where they can find you online, David?
Yeah, go to noeasyanswerspodcast.com, and if you want to join up and subscribe and get access to all our bonus features, including Nam TV, my Vietnam show, and our latest trilogy on 9/11, 9 theses on 9/11, really 9 provocations on 9/11, go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. But really, Nostalgia Trap is the brand. So thanks for having me on, Jules. I really appreciate it. And it's great to talk to you again, Max. It makes me hearing your voice makes me remember sort of our first conversations about not just like the technical elements of starting a podcast, but like, what the fuck are we even doing this for? Because as I remember, I mean, you and I are both sort of, outcast, disgruntled academics in a way as well. And there was a bond there. And I think that as I've done the show, I've discovered more and more people who are sort of on the edges of the academy for reasons of class and otherwise. And that's a really, I think, important constituency to sort of, I don't know, gather. There's some power in that. So nostalgiatrap.com is where it's at.
Fuck yeah. No, I mean, right back with you, man. It's really been a tremendous amount of fun talking to both of you guys. And yeah, I mean, again, like let's not lose sight of those really important and valuable things that are worth fighting for, like David said. I mean, we've been living through fucking hell with this pandemic for 2 years. I mean, like, but because of the media that we have and the way that we use it, like I'm able to spend 2 hours across the like country talking to you guys about this kind of stuff and feel like I'm right in the room with you and share it with listeners. Like that's pretty fucking cool. Right. And I guess just to like really staple that to a final note for folks who are listening, right? What's missing, what we can all try to do, and none of us is going to be able to do it alone, right? Is to take, like the tools that we have available to us, right? And really use them in context, right? Like use them as more than the end of itself in politics, right? Whether we're talking about, coffee houses and their role in building a larger anti-war movement, whether we're talking about one newspaper 100 years ago and its role in fomenting a larger revolutionary movement, right? None of those single mediums or places like was the thing that did it, right? It was all part of an interconnected ecosystem of thought and action and feeling. And I think like to tie this together, like one of the reasons why there is not a fucking like robust anti-war movement in the United States, right, is because of all the reasons that we're talking about, because of the reality of war, the reality of the military has been increasingly wiped out of the view of our regular reality, but also because more and more that the more that the left has no institutional power, no kind of like robust political or kind of lasting grassroots power,
and no global vision. I'm sorry. I mean, I mentioned the Bernie Sanders thing, but like the whole left as like bringing back the New Deal and that's it. To me, like extracts like what was the left's purpose for 200 years or more, which was to create a global anti-capitalist movement that showed solidarity across borders, and that's something that I don't hear too many left podcasts talking about, honestly, and I'm not shitting on anyone in particular. I think it's a big problem, is the lack of internationalism.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And
anyway,
it's like, so media, again, they have to be the things that connect us to that stuff. So like we need to take that anti-war fervor, that kind of global vision, and direct people to places where they can put it into practice, connect people who are doing that work. It has to be more than media. It has to be more than social media. It has to be more than communication. Communication has to be that connecting point to real action. And that's what I think a lot of us are missing. Like, we're missing that connection to, a labor movement that for all intents and purposes has been broken to practically nothing. Let alone a global popular vision for leftist politics, let alone an anti-war movement. Long roundabout way of kind of tying that up to say that it's an honor to be in this struggle with y'all and to kind of like try to use the tools available to us to put people not only in connection with others who can help them think better, but also empower them to act and be better and do better in the worlds that they live in. Nostalgia Trap has been important for me in that respect. It's a beautiful thing to see No Easy Answers kind of growing to fill that role for other people. And I can only hope that, Working People has been that for, even just a few people, right? It's not everything, but it's something. And so if you want to find Working People, we're at Working Pod on Twitter. Find a podcast on whatever your favorite podcast player is. Check us out. Check out the Real News Network. And thank you for listening to us talk about all this depressing stuff for 2 hours.
Thanks, Max. You're the best.
Thanks, buddy.
Thanks, man.
I saw someone refer to you as our studs Turkle, and I was like, that's high praise, and that's really no one else is doing the work you're doing out there. I was like, I'm already like, why aren't there 40 other Working People podcasts? There should be, because
there should be.
Yeah, really. It's such a ripe territory for exploring what's going on. So thank you all. Seriously, this was great.
Thanks, brother.
Cool.
Thanks, Jules.
Yeah, man.
Hold your head up high, it's all true.